Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and today I'd like to introduce you to someone who has had an uncommon influence on my thinking around processes of social change. Peter Block is a widely admired author and paradigm shaper in the areas of organization development, community building, and civic engagement. He's been no shy upstart in puncturing what you might broadly locate as Western beliefs around the nature of change. Where I've grown up in an age that idolizes the machinery of scale, Peter begins with relationship and connectedness. Where it's common to enter many well-intended intervention initiatives where the first session on the agenda is defining the problem at hand, Peter advises beginning with the power of possibility, a positive moral vision, the gifts that are already at the table. Most credibly, and not unrelated, in a generation that's all too aware of the complexity and vastness of the wicked problems we face at threat to human life and to the sustaining of our own societies, where it's tempting to trust only highly professionalized, outsourced solutions, Peter gently says, no. We must always first be the change we seek. The power is in our own hands. To put this as Dietrich Bonhoeffer once did, we must be a life community, not a volunteer society. Peter, thank you for bearing this possibility with you as you bring your life and observations to me and our listeners today. It's really an honor to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Well, Ann, thank you for understanding. If I'd heard you introduce me, I would not have had to write these books. It's beautiful, and I love that notion of it's a life project, not a volunteer. We're not volunteers. And just thank you so much. That's as clear an expression as I've ever heard of things I care about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your work. A lot of us read many things, but years ago at a crucial inflection point of, I was actually writing my own first book around character formation, which really turned into a book about community and organizational health and logic. And there was something in reading your work that almost permanently relined the starting points of what I value and how I see what's actually going on, often at the invisible level. So there's so much more I could have said. I was going to give a sampling of quotes from your work, but I sort of impromptu decided, let's just let this come out in this dialogue here. You're not going to acknowledge this, but in a lot of the worlds I love, community building worlds, people who think about sort of civic health, social reweaving, all those kinds of things, you are a giant, a thinker in all that. And yet I have sometimes understood you to be slightly outside, say, the established corridors of conventional wisdom, say in the whole change the world do-gooder subset of folks. Is there a way you can articulate the central thread of your work? What is at the heart of your worldview, if you can express it in language?
All your life, all you want to do is make a difference. And then when you find out perhaps you have, all you can do is argue against it. But I'm not going to do that. Okay, but thank you. You know, the worldview begins with your question, what words can I find? That's the worldview, that all transformation is linguistic. It's not just words. Sticks and stones don't hurt my bones. Words make a difference. And so it's really all of us discovering a language. And your kind introduction, that you reading me, it didn't rewire anything. It just affirmed the part of your thinking. And it gave you permission. And I think that's what we do for each other. I let you know that you're not crazy. And to create an alternative culture. So one weave is just the language matters. And the naming of things is what creates them. We live in second point is we live in a world of powerful empire, colonialism, call it what you want. And maybe it's always been there. It doesn't matter to me. And so we're trying to find a language and a way of being together that's an alternative to a colonial empire business perspective mindset. And you said it beautifully. That mindset believes in speed and scale and convenience. And what I have felt since the first day I got interested in this area is that something's dehumanizing about the way we do ourselves in our culture and in our institutions. And so it's a rehumanization project. The third thought is there's nobody to blame. Now, this took me a long time in my own devolution to realize that I am responsible not only for my own life, my own future, but also the meaning that I give to my own trail, to my own path. And if that's true, whatever my story is, everybody's interested in our story, their story, her story, his story. It's all a construction. We just made it up. People say, I want to speak my truth to power. I pray for people like that, including me, because it's not truth and they don't have power. They just have position. And so the idea is that basically we have the choice to describe and name the world we want to inhabit. To me, is that the essence of the rehumanization in the face of the modern life, modern this, modern that. And your stance, your beautiful writing, your speaking, Comment magazine, is to try, in my mind, to restore our humanity.
Yeah. Well, talk about reading back. I guess we're boomeranging each other right now, Peter, because I need you to do I'm rewriting Comment's manifesto as we speak, and you just said it better than I've been agonizing over it for months. And that ultimately it's a rehumanization mission, very much so.
And that's what our stories are. That's what the biblical story is.
Yeah.
Is our journey trying to trust and believe in God. And what you're an advocate for is the utility of mystery, the utility of what we don't know. Because it's out of what we don't know that I affirm my existence. And you also said in your first book, you were kind of beginning your thinking about the individual, and that led to community. Well, that's what's missing till you came along, till I came along, was realizing community is more causal than individual development. In the 1800s, there was no such thing as a child. That's a recent invention. Childhood, parenthood. We have all these things that we think explain who I am. They don't explain anything. They maybe describe, but there's no insight. It's just what sense can I make of this? And that's what we're doing, is affirming. And the word of weaving is that the threads are not enough. Okay, I have a daughter who's a fashion designer, and I see what she gets in the mail are spools of thread. And then I look over and see what she's wearing, and I think, I got to watch her. I don't believe it. She tells me she turns those spools into an outfit. I don't believe her. And so community is fabric, social fabric. And that's what you're doing. That's our project. That's our goal. And we're up against it. We don't have a chance of succeeding, and we do it anyway. It's so individualizing. AI is profoundly unimportant, and yet we give it enormous attention. And the other thread is the fact that the only choice I have is what I pay attention to. Period. Everything else is wait and see.
Thank you for bringing up language there. As someone who probably by birth and just given disposition, it's not certainly not the only virtue out there, but I do love people. And somewhere along the way, I think growing up cross-culturally, in a way I couldn't have articulated until much later, saw so much of reality as fundamentally relational. And because of that, when I entered more the kind of intellectual world, publication world, think tank, a world that loves words and uses words, sometimes as weapons, sometimes as propaganda, sometimes as, very much part of the theory of influence, et cetera. I think I always felt like gosh, are words my enemy here? If like, how does is language just a construction of reality, that, and therefore it can be dangerous towards creating false realities or the fake? And just, there was an earlier part of my life, I was like, I just want to give words that much power. I'm interested in doers. I want to work with the hands. I want to, but I think as I might found myself perhaps given just a couple gifts in the realm of language, and I'm actually the granddaughter of a linguist, so I just appreciate the whole discipline. What you said is very beautiful to me and encouraging, that there is something about language that can inaugurate a new world. And it's not the only thing, but it is the foundational thing. And again, now speaking from a Judeo-Christian heritage here, there's this concept of words speaking a world into being and word becoming flesh. Like, these are ancient alchemies.
Beautiful. Hold that sentence. That's the name of your next book, is entitled An Ancient Alchemy. Mm. This is one little part where lead can be turned into gold.
Yeah.
And in the beginning was the word. And I don't know if it's true, but it sure has lasted. And I hold it to be true because it's useful, not because it's accurate. Okay. And part of your story thinks you can explain yourself by your grandfather and your Judeo-Christian this and your love of people that. And those are beautiful outfits, but they have nothing to do with the choice you're making as to what you're giving your life to. And to me, another thing you're doing with comment and with social change is confronting people with their freedom. And that one phrase has organized my existence. How do I confront myself with my freedom? And that's why I need you. I can't do it on my own. I can't do it at a mountaintop. And the church has bought the individualized story. It didn't start that way. In fact, there were 13 tribes. Only one of them was the ones that lasted, 13 Jewish tribes. And so, to me, that's the work. And the work is to kind of make the word and help people see that they can choose what they give attention to. And the form that attention takes is language.
Yeah.
And we think we're in a time of great innovation. Not even close. In the beginning was the word. I mean, so what you're doing is political. If somebody says, what's Anne up to? She's up to politics of the most dangerous sort, because she never and me too, will never use the word. All the years I was consulting, I had one client understood me. He said, I'd like to introduce Peter. He's the most dangerous man in America. And he thought, this is an executive at AT&T.
Talk about feeling seen.
Yes, exposed. Excuse me. I'll be back in an hour, maybe.
Thank you. Do you mind sharing a little bit, some stories for me? How did you come to your core beliefs?
I remember my earliest memory is being 5 years old. And I was at a neighbor's house. And his mother was mad at my friend. And she took him halfway up the stairs and spanked the hell out of him. I'd never seen violence up close before. And I remember looking at that and I said, it horrified me. So I can remember that a lifetime later. The only thing I know that's true about me is I'm a Jew. Do I practice? No. Do I know the language? No. And so, I don't know. The conclusion I drew from that is I never had a chance. I was going to be an outsider no matter what. And it didn't define me in a sense of explaining anything, but I think about that. And so my journey has been to live what I've written about. It's one thing to write about it. It took me, I was 40 before I was talking into writing, and it turned out I could write. It was never on my mind. Guy said, would you write a book? So that was a huge turning point. Here I gave a talk on consulting skills. He said, I'm a publisher. I'd like you to write a book about this. Leave me alone. Okay, it's hard enough to give a talk, to write it down. But I ended up writing it. So that was huge, to think that I had ideas. But the invitation to write was powerful. And then I was just struggling for a life. I heard a philosopher when I was 38 years old asked the question, do you feel lonely, alienated, isolated, anxious? When you read a list of psychological diagnosis, do you identify with all of them? And I thought, yes, 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 yes. I only look okay from a distance. And he paused and he says, those are not problems to be solved. That means you're a human being. And I just was flooded. As soon as the talk was over, I ran up to him. I said, my name is Peter. Where do you live? He said, I live in San Jose, California. Can I come and see you, please? And he said, yes. And I did. Peter Kestenbaum, existential philosopher. And his words, and so I've heard words. I heard Tim Galway tell me that training is useless, that there's a tennis player inside of you, and you have to discover it. Wow. So it changed my whole notion about learning and education. And I started a business about learning. Anyway, so, these are all markers, my construction. But I've always been drawn to what was an outsider inversion, and I just found I could make a living at it as long as I didn't get angry. And so I've been able to be with people who are at the center of the colonial world, and they don't piss me off.
How hard has it been not to get angry? Has that been a lifelong struggle?
Well, yes, it still is, especially with people I care most about. James Hollis says the purpose of marriage is to be irritated with one person over a long period of time. And so, you learn to put it somewhere else. If you want to get angry, do it after 6 p.m. If I'm in the middle of something, work, world, friends, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom. Because I know if I leave the room, is my anger justified? Of course it is. Can I explain it? Of course. But it's not useful with people that you're trying to connect with. And the world doesn't get that. I'm as angry as anybody, but you learn how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you thinking right now?
Well, I'm wondering if the honesty of responding to pain being brought to speech, or pain that happens right in front of you, or watching as a 5-year-old another kid get spanked at the top of the stairs, all these moments of sight and or betrayal, all the things of a fallen world that can create great anger. One of the greatest nobilities of being human is not so much learning how to manage it, but to be really honest about evil.
Yes.
And respond with a soft heart always that allows anger to come forth, but also to know how to release it and walk into a still deeper truth about love of the sinner.
That's beautiful. How to walk through it. And I can't manage it, but I can't hold it and be useful at the same time. So sometimes I have a mind to be useful. Other times, leave me alone. Where's my desert? Give me my 40 days. And then Jesus was probably screaming much of the time. And so there's a place, but what bothers me is we think it will take us somewhere. And underneath the anger, you said it beautifully. It's unbearable pain. I asked my friend Peter, I said, why is there so much pain in the world? Why is there so much suffering? And he said, that's a question for God, not for a philosopher, not for us. And that was helpful. And I thought, okay, so be it. Another great moment. I did a workshop for M&M Morris. So anybody who hired me, I always was so grateful to them. And it went great. And so at the end of the workshop, I go up to one of the guys. I say, I do this every 4 times a year. This is one of the best ones I've ever done. I can't figure out why this went so well. And he said, Peter, do you have to analyze life? Can't you just enjoy it?
Receive it, yeah.
I said, thank you. And the answer is no.
No. You're a wrestler, yeah. Thank you for sharing a bit of your path stops along the way of your own formation. And you mentioned this existential philosopher that you flew out to San Jose to see, or I assume you actually took him up on it.
Every chance I got.
But I am familiar with some other friendships in your life. I'm always drawn to friendships over the long haul that seem as much like melding of minds as they do sort of iron sharpening iron, and perhaps specifically those with what I would call like a prophetic gifting.
Beautiful.
Meeting one another and making one another feel less alone. And so I am aware of your relationship both with Walter Brueggemann, who has been a touchstone certainly for me, but a lot of comments work and some of our peer kind of magazines work, as well as John McKnight. And I was just wondering if you could speak either about both of those friendships specifically and or others that have really sort of if not changed you, solidified, granted permission, as you said earlier, shaped your thinking, made it better.
That's beautiful. What you just said is so powerful. It is a mind, a melding, a joining of the mind. And there's something prophetic. And I think my meeting them was no accident. And I'd been waiting for them much of my life. I just didn't know it took form. And John I read about, and he blew my mind apart and healed it all at the same moment by telling me gifts is the only thing worth focusing on. And so I always was attracted to deficiencies. I didn't learn till later why deficiencies are so attractive. It's because they're so easy to defend against. They mean nothing. People say, Peter, I'm disappointed in you. Thank you. Thanks for the feet. Bye-bye. Gifts, I don't know what to do with. And so John, I met him. A police chief in Longmont, Colorado, invited us both to speak at a conference. And I had read some of his essays. And he was there, and I was the speaker to open the conference. And this is a police chief on community. So I give my talk, take a break. Hi, Peter, I'd like you to meet John McKnight. And John says, Peter, you just gave my talk. He's been talking about triangles and circles all my life. And I said, you're John McKnight? Oh my God, I'm glad I didn't know, or I would have been unable to speak in front of you. And he said, Peter, I'm about to give a talk now. Would you join me? So that was it. And I did. So John and I, met the world. It's friendship and ideas is what brings me, it animates my life. It's pathetic. I had a body worker once in my 30s who told me that I had violin strings running between my throat and my belly button, and her job was to soften them. That's how tight I was. And I said, what's going to go wrong with me? She said, your knees. I said, why are my knees going to go wrong? She says, you're tall and you live in your head. You don't have a body. And your knees are going to get tired of holding you up because you're all head. And she was right.
Good for her.
Good for her. And so John and I, intellectually, it's a miracle. And the gifts thing, and we were, John had studied oratory. And so he would give talks and then I'd say, thank you, John, and I'd break them into small groups. And this was the union that we were, that I know what to do with a room, that I was able to translate the ideas that you beautifully express, the movement from psychology to community, the language stuff. So I know how, if whatever room I'm in, to construct conversations that I know will take people somewhere, especially if this is not what they had in mind or not what they came for.
Exactly. There's the mystery.
The mystery. And you never want to pair people up with people they know the most, because they'll never be surprised.
Right. Exactly.
And then Walter found John and I. John and I wrote a book. And he said, Peter, you can write and I can talk. Were you interested in doing a book together? And so, of course. And so we talked a book into existence. And then I wrote it. And Walter read it. And Walter believed that the wilderness, what resided there, was neighborliness, neighborhood, okay, and community. So we wrote a book, Abundant Community, with abundance being John's gift to me, the world. And Walter wrote a review, and somebody told John, hey, this Old Testament guy wrote a review of your book. And John said, who's Walter Brueggemann? And his friend was a bishop in Minnesota. He said, Walter's just about the best known Old Testament scholar in the world. And John and I go, oh my God. And so I remember John loved jazz. And so we were sitting in Cincinnati with the brass screaming at us, reading on my cell phone Walter's review of us. And it turns out he was moving distance, so we became friends. We called him back and said, Walter, this is Peter. Hi. Could we talk?
And he moved to Ohio.
He moved to Cincinnati.
Actually, wow. Was that because of you?
No, he was retiring from Atlanta, from Emory. Yeah.
Oh, Emory. Okay.
Columbia and St. Louis. And he wanted a southernmost northern city. So he chose Cincinnati out of nowhere. And so the three of us started traveling together. People would find out about us and say, would you come and talk to Milwaukee? And so we would go, and it would be the same thing. Walter talks. Does Walter? I say, thank you. Small groups. Come back. Thoughts? John, thank you. Small groups. And so the three of us became, I don't know, they opened worlds for me, and I think we've opened worlds for each other. He gave me a memory. See, I didn't know. I knew I was a Jew, but I had no memory of it. And
that's what I was going to ask.
He told me that the Exodus was my story. And Pharaoh is the world we're living in. He gave me language that describes my world without feeling it's exceptional. We're the greatest country in the world. Really? No ranking puts us there. All right? And every ranking of health, infant mortality, well-being, violence, we're about 20th in the world. And he taught me that this is something larger than my whiny complaints and belief that somehow there's nothing. And that's what the Exodus, you get sentences and they form your life. So Peter Kestenbaum told me that what I thought was my problem was being human. They didn't go away, but it changed my relationship to my alienation and isolation and anxiety. And John told me that I'm not a deficiency, that you're a gift waiting to be brought into the world, and that people we label as homeless, poor, that labeling is an assault on their humanity. And so the progressive world is into that labeling, and you question that labeling, and people get mad at you. God bless them. All right, and Walter, I asked him, I said, why did it take the Jews 400 years? This one idea. He says, because they couldn't imagine being free. So one phrase organized my existence. Wow. So maybe that's my work in the world, is helping the world imagine that freedom is a possibility. Why am I doing that? Because I'd like to imagine that myself. And so these phrases, and you drop them, and you have that orientation. It just comes out of you. You get no credit for it, okay? But it's what happens to pop out. And then those people, those phrases capture our collective experience. And Peter, I saw him, I would go listen to him give talks on philosophy. I didn't know what he's talking about. I'd go spend 2 days at a seminar, and I'd sit there and say, what am I doing here? And then all of a sudden he'd drop a phrase. And like he said, I'm warning you now, if you argue with me, I'm going to take your side. Oh my God. And I grew up in a world where people like to argue. My mother would order sandwiches, and she'd argue with the chef behind the counter in the delicatessen. And she said, there's too much fat on here. She had a hatred of fat. I got a call at 2 a.m. once because she threw a tray that had butter on it at the intern in the hospital. Because she could. This is where I grew up. And she'd yell, there's too much. And lady, that's as lean as it gets. And she's yelling across the restaurant. And she says, well, Larry doesn't have so much fat on his corned beef. And he says, well, Larry's not here today, lady. And I'm sitting there, this is my mother. And I say, Dorothy, what just happened? She says, I don't know, something comes up. So I grew up in a world of argument.
Yes. And probably to argue was to belong, I'm guessing.
That's how you made love, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And so Peter says to me, if you argue with me, that changed everything. It gave me a way of being in the middle of the world, in my own tendency. And all of a sudden something clicks. That's what you're doing with your comment. That's why you write. That's why you speak. That's why. And then people will make something of what you say, and you thank God for that.
Can you recall one of the first times you had an aha moment, whether you were doing a workshop, a facilitation, you were brought in either to a corporate setting or like a gathering of movers and shakers who come from different organizations, or it's a local town council? I imagine there have been so many different collective forms where you have watched a collection of individuals learn how to put aside the ego, learn how to really listen to one another, and actually move together as one towards solving a problem or casting forward a movement of hope, not fear. Like just that conversion in a community context. I would love for you to tell a story of you both sort of somehow sowing that possibility and then watching it happen.
There's little pieces of it I can respond to. One is that what you're describing is all of us, okay? And it's not like I go from being self-centered to being generous. The generous is always there. And that we together have a choice on what we want to evoke in each other. So it's an evocation. It's evoking. And what my gift is to have a sense of what kind of architecture, social architecture, structure, activism, relational activism will bring forth and invite people to care about something larger than what they came in with. It's waiting for us. And I was waiting for that. And I feel my real gift was when invitations came from unlikely places. I said yes. Didn't matter how I felt. I had a professor, I was on my way to becoming a systems engineer because I was so tired of being poor, just weary, embarrassed by it. And he stopped me in the hall. He says, Peter, there's this field called organizational development. I think you'd like it. And I was stunned. I said, really? I didn't even know he knew I existed. I said, what would I do? He said, well, you go to graduate school and study it. and you can go to these 3 schools. And I said, I don't have any money. He said, you don't need money if they let you in. I said, okay. And I did. I applied. They let me in, and I discovered a world. But I said yes to him instead of saying, no, I'm choosing safety. I'd never been east of the Mississippi. I went to the University of Kansas and thought that was out of my league. And then I went to Yale because they gave me the most money. And I'd never been east of I had to borrow $100 from my uncle. Melvin, can you give me $100? Otherwise, I can't get to New Haven. But I said yes to that, and I went back there. And over and over again, when invitations to unlikely places have come along, I said yes. So I feel that what we're doing in the world, what you're doing, David, all of us, is helping people find the support to say yes to what's in front of them, and to say yes to the invitation that the world is offering, and stop trying to fix the world and to join. And that's the hardest thing, because the fixing is what creates the suffering, not the colonialism, not the empire. Pharaoh didn't create the suffering. Pharaoh did what Pharaoh does. Mars is the god of war. You don't go to Mars and say, could I invite you to a peace conference?
Well, Peter Block might if he's consulting with Mars.
And that is a gift. And I accept that somehow. And I learned that early on. The first thing I learned how to do was run tea groups, which was a low-structured way of focusing on relationships. And I learned to trust that it given people some support and a context. And what we're doing, when you write and you speak and you pod, you're trying to create a context in which people can live into all the things we want to. And that's why we need each other. And that's why the book I sent you that's coming out now is to reframe activism. Because right now we think to be an activist is to wait for someone else's transformation. I mean, do we really think more training and unconscious bias is going to impact the police department and help them make us safe? Come on, we can make so let's create activism together, us, that's relation-based, that's a feminine form of power. The other gift for me is that I, at some point, was willing to surrender to the feminine. Now, I took it too far in terms of my personal relationships, but the feminine as an alternative to and so we need a form of activism that's based on relationship. Instead of waiting for your transformation, why don't the two of us, starting now, because it's all we got, decide how to create a room, a breath, a conversation that will help us create a world we want to inhabit. That's all we have to do. I have no idea what's best for others, but I do have an idea of what kind of world I want to inhabit. And I have learned to have faith in my capacity to produce that world one room at a time. And it's pathetic, it's short. But a friend of mine, again, one sentence, Dan Joyner, theory of change. Okay, he's working with schools. He says slow, small, and cheap.
Yeah.
Well, see, I wrote books trying to make that point. And so this to me is relational activism, is let's go slow, let's go small. What do you mean small? I mean, wherever you are.
The particular and the personal and the here. Yeah.
This is what the feminine understand.
Yeah. Yes.
This is what the artist understands. Another phrase from Peter was art is understanding the nuance of experience. There's a precision to art and theater and painting that captures a moment and a place. So why did Gauguin take 3-4 years to paint pictures of a bunch of fruit? Come on, man. Because he knew how important that picture was. Why do you spend hours getting the phrase right? Because you know how important that phrase is.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for, I think, giving voice to the feminine. I have a mentor who actually you may know, McCarter. He founded something called Community Renewal International down in Louisiana about 35 years ago. And he'll say the village was the invention of woman.
Wow. Beautiful.
And I've always appreciated that as I find myself someone who also does really honor the value of institutions for long-term transgenerational change, inheritance. Like I have kind of a love for, I guess because I have a love for history and a long past, present, future arc. So on the one hand, I really value structures and kind of architectural scaffolding and the engineering, all that.
Yes.
And this other more organic pulse that
Yes.
I can't, it's hard to put, it is very hard to put
No,
words
you are
to.
putting words on it, and you can have both.
You can have both, right?
You can have both. You are both. You and are both.
Thank you.
And in a way, our instinct is to apologize for caring about institutions. But to not care for institutions is cowardice. It's the easy way out. Why don't we create architecture, structure, engineers that hold people for all that they are, for the feminine? And I want both. You know, you need problem solving, just not now.
I really appreciated what you said earlier at this notion of gift and seeing gifts. And what did you say about why we tend to be so much more fixated on deficiencies?
Because they demand nothing of us, and they're easy to defend, and it becomes a place of hiding.
Right. So I that makes a ton of sense to me, and I'm reticent to ask you to even name broader deficiencies, but part of this sort of 6-month series where the comment has been exploring on social and cultural change throughout history today is animated by an observation that at some, like I long to be part of like a renewed, for instance, in the American context, I long to be part of a new version of sort of the civil rights movement, and to feel that like many becoming one, and to watch hearts and minds soften, and true solidarity, and that sense of like what begins really local and bubbles up somewhat simultaneously with, on the one hand, lots of strategy, and I would also say sort of a move of the spirit, a wave that even if it's of course internally rambunctious and fractious and there's disagreements and arguments, there is an overarching coherence at least when you retrospectively look back. And it has felt like more recently a lot of the sort of successful cultural movements, whether they've been successful legally or have made a lot of noise on Twitter, a lot of the time it seems they fairly quickly devolve into renewed factionalism, suspicion, reactivity, all the polarization, et cetera. And I don't exactly understand why all that is. We could name a bunch of, trend lines and pathologies in our and weaknesses, I guess, in our culture these days. But it is out of a desire to see unity, I guess, in a society, and to see healed relationship and moving forward toward hope that can have very practical implications, in solving a whole bunch of problems. So I say all that to ask you, what is keeping us, in your observation, what is sort of keeping so many of us stuck?
The movement is here. We just don't see it. We don't know it. And we're allowing other people to manage the attention. Why do I take it seriously? I don't feel like we're divided. The story is we're divided. People say, oh, we're polarized. We polarize because it captures attention. It's good news. My belief, why I'm interested in you and others, is that journalism is where the transformation, all we have to do is reconstruct what we call the story. There's things happening around me. I joined a neighborhood council, and I did that because I'm writing books about community, and my wife said, Peter, why don't you try it? All right, damn it. Damn it. And so I did. I said, and they said, well, at least you'll keep the seat being taken by somebody worse than you. And I said, that's a commitment I can fulfill. And then what I learned was we didn't do anything important, but the way we were together, it connected me to the place I live. I learned the backstory. And that's because we got together once a month at committees. And so why don't we decide together that the movement is alive and well? The civil rights movement was hundreds of years in the making. It was TV that, when TV got interested in the violence on a bridge, all of a sudden our attention, that became a move. So we can do that in a minute by deciding what to give attention to. And that's what you're doing with this podcast. That's what you're doing with comment. We just don't, it's hard to value being in the middle of it. But there is a movement. So the book I'm writing, I've got story after story of where the future exists in the present. So there's a chapter in your fall version, whatever you frame it. And I like the way you take different themes, so you're not just about one thing. And you have great faith in yourself, Anne.
Well, I don't know if I feel that way, but I'm glad that...
I know you don't. And the faith you have in yourself is when something comes to mind, you're willing to pursue it. That's an act of faith. There's no evidence. You have no credentials. I'm not interested in your story or how many schools you went to or whether you got a B+ in English in the 9th grade, okay?
C-, actually. That's a funny story.
C-. Okay.
My English teacher told me in 9th grade, I was so like, why did I get a C-? She's like, Anne, your verbs need to grow up. I've never forgotten that advice.
Oh my God.
So I'm so grateful to her. It has been a game changer for me.
that was an act of love.
It was.
See? And yeah, as soon as your verbs grow up, you can grow up.
That's right.
And you have. But you trust when something gets inside you, you're willing to pursue it. You're willing to go public. You're willing to name it. And if what you did was reasonable, it wouldn't be useful. But you do it in a context. You'd have a spiritual context. Other people have a communal context. Other people want science. They want to know, where does love reside in my brain? Okay, doesn't matter, but you have learned to follow those instincts. And that's your gift. That's one of your gifts. In doing that, you invite others to do the same. Everybody needs to decide what is the fall theme going to be, except to call it my life. You're doomed as part of comment, okay? But that's a metaphor for your life. And you say, where is the civil rights movement? Well, it's in what you're creating. It's hard. I'm talking about myself here. It's hard for me to value what I'm part of. And it's dawning on me, fourth quarter, to accept my gifts, because they create an obligation to me that I don't know if I'm up for. Deficiencies, I'm up for them. Of course I'm this, of course I'm that, have been always. Gifts, suppose I'm just getting started. We discount the fourth quarter of life. And someday someone will write about that. But mentor is a form of making me irrelevant. Oh, I'm living through others? Would you be my mentor? Hell no, I'm not done yet. Okay, I've been involved in raising a bunch of children. I'm not sure it went that well. Why would I want more? And so, we're just getting started. I need you to get started. We're partners. And the movement is here. And activism is waiting to be validated as being relational activism, not feet on the street, not protest. Because I identify with that. It gets our attention, but it doesn't change. Something more is required, so we need post-protest activism. And that's what you are. That's your language. That's what your verbs, now that they've matured. And that's what you and I have the gift of finding language that has the potential to stick. For years, people told Peter, you're just a bunch of one-liners. And I always thought that as affirmation of how shallow am I. and I should have said, thank you. I'll take it. Maybe maybe this is poetry. David White changed my life. I heard him give a talk, and I invited him into the corporate world. And he says, poetry is precise speaking.
I'm right now, literally, the ceiling where we're talking, right above me is a guest room, and on the little nightstand is David White's book of poetry, The House of Belonging. Literally, that's the one book right above me, and when guests come.
I heard him give a talk at a spirituality psychology conference in Washington, and I said, David, could I talk to you? He said, sure. I said, I've never heard a poet that I could connect with before. Would you be interested in joining me in my corporate life? And he said, absolutely, and he did. And so every time we ran a workshop on consulting skills, relationship, whatever, I would invite David into the room and poetry, and it was amazing. And so I really think the invitations are there if we just say yes to them, that's what you're doing. You're saying, what difference does your magazine, does your publication make? It encourages people to say yes to what's there waiting for them. We don't need more training. I don't need to go to an empathy workshop. My granddaughter studies peace and justice at Georgetown, and she's never experienced language being more weaponized than people fighting for peace and fighting for justice. Now, I probably just got her in trouble, but she just graduated, so she should be able to escape with her life. But I think the movement's here. We just have to see it. This is the Jews. Anyway, and you're it, and we're it, and we're stuck with each other. And at some point, we'll know how to take advantage of the access we have,
Thanks, Peter. This whole conversation has been such a gift, truly. May I end with one parting question?
I have a lifetime.
Okay. How would you encourage all of us to be attentive? What is it that we should keep eyes open for? What frame should we seek to bring to a world that is daily bludgeoned with scary headlines and a lot of apocalyptic fears and so on and so on? In our own context, in the broader societal context, are there some compass points you could lend?
Well, you've just done it. What you see is what you get. So let's stop talking about the world according to other people's versions, including the front page of the New York Times. It reinforces the story of what's wrong with us. Stop calling people who are serving the common good heroes. They're not heroes. They're neighbors. They're waiting for us to recognize them for what they're doing, and don't give them awards. Ask them, what are you doing tomorrow after work? What do we care about? Each of us has a convening. Every listener, reader that you and I have can convene people around them and say, can we talk about what we care about and how we can accelerate and make this happen within reach, and do it without waiting, and stop having other people name me. All right? There's no such thing as Generation X. There's no such thing as a millennial. Those are marketing strategies. Hello? People want to know who are we selling to? Well, let's position them. This is who they are, so we know what to sell them. And so what you're speaking to are people who are willing to step aside from a consumer culture, from the belief that whatever I need, I can purchase, and stop reinforcing the illusion that we're divided. Of course we are. Of course there's violence in the world. It breaks my heart I was born into that violence. All right? I remember the Second World War. I remember my family members. I knew my stories of how we came to this. So violence isn't new, but how we relate to it, we have a choice. And what you're doing is you're a magnet. You are an invitation, as is every reader, to find 4 or 5 people to say, what do we care about? Is it raising a child? Is it safety? And what can we do within reach? And then decide that's who we are. Why do I let somebody else with an economic interest tell me who I am? Of course there's violence, but making the violence the center of our attention doesn't reduce it. It feeds it. And it's horribly complicated. That's why you and I are still interested in the world is and the audience we have. And I really believe that we create the world with our attention. The reader creates the book. Whoever listens to this podcast is deciding what it's about. So why don't I honor that? Why don't I say thank you for using me to decide what matters to you? And help people not find like-minded people. Like-mindedness scares the hell out. But find people within reach, in your neighborhood, in your family, around you, and talk about what do we care about? And there's this one small thing, one breath at a time, one day at a time. In the spring, it's one weed at a time. And I think you're doing it. It's happening. Let's see it. This is what Walter gave me. This is the wilderness. The Jews left Pharaoh, went into the wilderness. Half of them wanted to go back. So why is the world choosing predictability, uncertainty? And what you are, what we are, is affirmation that there's other options to be attracted by what's certain. And I don't know. Your questions are answers.
Thank you, Peter. This has been such a gift from start to finish. Thank you. Thank you for who you are, your life, and your time. Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution. We are officially back after a break since our spring season covering all things social change. But it shouldn't feel all that long ago, as this season is continuing the conversation by diving in to the real-life hopes and tensions faced by those contemporary upstarts today who are intentionally going outside the status quo values of scale and systems to more discrete levers and creative embodiments. We hope you will be sufficiently intrigued that you'll toggle over from this podcast to our summer issue at www.comment.org, where you'll find a more historical take in the same vein. We are in the business of fostering an imagination for a thriving society animated by the Christian humanist tradition. Comment publishes pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. The Welcome Table is hosted by Greg Thompson. Zealots at the Gate is a feisty podcast about religion and democracy featuring Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig, and a whole lot more. We are also blooming into a real-time hub of conversation made up of writers, readers, civic leaders, and community weavers. We'd love for you to participate in that conversation and help us grow. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.